teacher morale is incredibly low, as it has been, and it's not pay issues. Like classroom complexity is so incredibly difficult these days. The composition and complexity. So too many students to really handle, and no AI is going to fix that problem.
Welcome to the Education Matters podcast. I'm your host, Jason Bukhari, and today we're joined by Dr. Alec Couros, an internationally recognized professor of education who works at the intersection of education and technology. Alec is a full professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina and the director of the Center of Teaching and Learning. Over his career, he has delivered hundreds of keynotes and workshops around the globe on topics ranging from open education and network learning to digital citizenship, critical media literacy, and artificial intelligence. A passionate advocate for open access in education, Alec is committed to the use of open access publications, MOOCs, and open boundary courses to reimagine how we share knowledge, collaborate, and learn in a networked world. His contributions have earned him numerous awards for innovation in teaching and learning, and solidifying his reputation as one of the most relevant voices in education today. So for those of you who've been tuning into multiple episodes, I thank you. I truly appreciate your support. I hope you've enjoyed the biographical beginnings to each conversation. Origin stories have always really fascinated me, and with someone like Alec, who's done countless interviews and podcasts, I'm confident you'll discover something new about the person behind the ideas. And so it's fitting that Alec's story unfolds with a wonderfully humble Canadian beginning. Growing up in Humboldt, Saskatchewan, Alec's early years were shaped by the values of his immigrant parents who fled post-war Greece in search of a better life in Canada. They instilled in their children a deep respect for education and hard work, values Alec carried with him from his father's restaurant to eventually the classroom. Whether peeling potatoes or wrestling with his brother George, another internationally recognized educator by the way, Alec's upbringing was steeped in lessons about community, resilience, and creativity. In this episode, we dive into Alec's reflections on teaching and learning, as well as the complexities of integrating AI into education. Alec offers, as always, a nuanced perspective on how AI can enhance creativity, bridge equity gaps, and support personalized learning, while also raising critical questions about ethics, access, and the unintended consequences of these technologies. Alec offers a perspective on how AI can enhance creativity, bridge equity gaps, and support personalized learning, while also raising questions about the ethics, access, and unintended consequences of these technologies. Alec also shares an honest and raw take on the challenges educators face today, from addressing the needs of increasingly diverse classrooms to navigating teacher shortages in rural and northern communities. Alec's scholarship and critical engagement with the role of technology in shaping education and society is significant, not just for Canadians, but for the necessary task of connecting global educators and creating global citizens. I think he's one of the most necessary voices in education today, so I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Alec Couros. Alec, welcome to the podcast. Where does this podcast find you?
Yeah, it's finding me pretty well, and in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada, Treaty 4 territory. I'm in the former lands of the Anishinaabe and Nehawak, and the home of the Métis Nation, as well as the Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota peoples. I'm very fortunate to live on these lands and to have been here most of my life and to have raised my children here. But now it's known as Regina, Saskatchewan, and happy to be here and to connect with you today.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I would have given you a proper introduction at this point, but maybe update us on what you've been up to lately.
Sure. I've been a professor at the Faculty of Education at the U of R since '99 in various roles. My status is full professor of education. My area is educational technology media. I'm now currently the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at the university, which allows me to work with faculty across the institution and help them think about their practice and perhaps improve their practice. being more thoughtful about it, thinking about how the intersection of research and teaching, I think is really important. Researching our own practice and coming up with questions around our own practice. We often separate those things in the academy, and so that's one of the big things I do. And of course, introducing new technologies. From my perspective, AI has been a real big one. Especially since 2022, late 2022, when ChatGPT came out. That's where I'm spending a lot of my time with faculty, is helping them rethink what's happening in the classroom, and especially around academic integrity. It's become a crisis of academic integrity in many ways, for the use of ChatGPT and all that. I'm sure we'll get into that later on, but it's interesting because things haven't been so urgent as they have been lately, and that's when you get faculty more willing to learn when it's a crisis, which isn't always the greatest time. But I'm happy for anyone that walks through the door and who sends me an email, and the hundreds of people that are showing up for workshops versus the dozens that came before. And so it really is a crisis across institutions all over the country and beyond.
Yeah, that's certainly interesting, and I do want to dive into all of that, because I know for years and years and years you've been a leader in the education and technology space, and you've always been a source for me of great insight and motivation and inspiration. So we're definitely going to dive into all of your work, especially the work around AI. I'm particularly interested in, but I want to start with young Alec Couros. Where did you and when did you grow up?
Well, I'm a Gen Xer. I grew up I was born in 1971. So everyone knows my age now, so that's probably something you could have Googled. Born in that time where, I could walk around my small hometown and be out all day, and my parents didn't really care where I was. Well, they did care where I was. It just didn't seem as urgent as it was today. And we had a key at the front of our house where everyone in the community knew where the key was, and they could get in if they needed to. Humboldt, Saskatchewan, which became later in the news quite a bit with the tragedy, the Humboldt Broncos tragedy, a few years back. But a town of 5,000 people, pretty small community. 4 schools, three elementary and one high school, and that's where it was a good place to grow up. I miss Humboldt and my old home there, and I go see Dad's grave once in a while. But it was a good place to be. And then I moved from there to Saskatoon, lived there for 10 years, did my undergraduate and graduate work. Some of my graduate work, my master's, and then to Regina, Saskatchewan. So I've born and raised in Saskatchewan. Good place to be. I've been to many other places, but still, this is home, and it always will be.
Growing up, how did you, your friends, your sibling, how did you play?
How do we play? That's an interesting. I don't know. What do I remember of those times? We were all 4 years apart, so it was 4 or 5 years apart, so it was different. I probably remember spending most time with my younger brother George, who is an author and owns a printing company now, and is known for his work on the innovator's mindset. I remember wrestling with him. He was a big WWF wrestler fan, and we kind of fight. We played basketball once in a while. I'd tease him. It was kind of an interesting time, because when I was in grade 12, he was in grade 8, I think. Mm-hmm. We never were in high school together. So it was, and play was different. I mean, we'd just do things with our friends typically, and we'd intersect sometimes, and our friends would intersect. But at the same time, we owned a restaurant, so I was at the restaurant a lot of the time. I was, peeling potatoes from the age of, I don't know, feels like 5, making pizzas, waiting tables a bit later, and I spent a lot of my time there. So, it wasn't, we just didn't sit at the house and play. We were at school. We'd watch the Flintstones every noon hour. And,
Hmm.
later on, we'd realize how horrifying some of the stereotypes and the racism in that show are. But every day I got home from school, I would go to the restaurant, eat there. The first 5 minutes were farm news. We'd watch, look at the price of the crops, and then watch the Flintstones. Then go back to school, and that's where I'd see George. And then, the rest of the time was intramurals, sports, that sort of thing. But a lot of time spent at the restaurant, so it was our second home.
I don't know why I got the feeling that you did way more at the restaurant than George. I don't know George well at all, but I just feel
That,
like being an older brother that he got out of a lot of duties there.
yeah, that's true for sure. I mean, he participated in more sports, and that was his thing. And I spent more time at the restaurant for sure. I think about all four kids. I'm thinking I spent the most time. I could be wrong, but that's my perspective anyway.
Hmm.
And I was probably the one, if anyone, who was going to take over the restaurant. Never did. Thought about it. Still think about it. It's a little bit late now, but and my dad and I actually, after I left and went into my undergraduate, we started a restaurant in Saskatoon. So he actually closed the restaurant and moved, and we tried that for a few years while I was doing my undergraduate. And yeah, just never panned out the way that we thought it might be. But yeah, I was probably the one who was going to do it. Never did. Have some regrets, but at the same time, it all works out.
But that's life, isn't it? I mean, I could kind of see at
Yeah.
the Greek Brothers restaurant. I could. It almost sells itself.
There's still time. There's still time.
There's still time. Yeah, you never say never. Is there anything about your upbringing that you wish kids today could experience?
I think it was just that, that sense of independence. I think that's very different. Like when I was 16, I got my license, and we drove around town all day. We did something called the cruise, where you would just basically do this loop around town, and you'd see all your friends. It was just kind of a waste of time, but it was something. And we didn't have cell phones to tell our parents exactly where we were. And I still remember, if we just went to Saskatoon, which was an hour away, which is the nearest big city, to tell our parents where we were, we wouldn't have access to a lot of funds. And, we go to a payphone, and we do the old trick where you just, it says, "This is SaskTel. You have a collect call from," and instead of saying your name, we'd say, "Alec, or Mom and Dad, it's me. We're fine," and we'd say that really quickly, and that was our pager eventually, and they couldn't say anything on the other end, or we couldn't hear them, but they didn't have to accept the call. It was just our way of texting, I guess. And, lots of good memories
It
to
was
come
the
back to.
genius. It was the genius move back in the day. I remember
It was the hack, right?
Dad, come pick me up. I'm at high school near Gym C. And
Yeah.
you would hear him on the other end go, "Hello, who's this?" It took him a while to get it, but eventually it
Yeah.
worked.
Yeah, so that was our way of texting. I'm not sure many would really understand that today, but I do think it was just that the ability to just go and do things and be safe. And I don't know, my kids are highly anxious, and it's not. I don't think it's their fault. I mean, it's the culture that embraces them, as well as the way that we parent is very different. I think in terms of I mean, and I'm not saying it was good. I didn't wear a
Mm.
seatbelt. I didn't have a bike helmet, and we can get into that conversation. And obviously, those weren't good things, and many kids got hurt and seriously injured because of those things. But it's the medium is the message. That's your first McLuhan lesson.
Mm.
You bring in particular technologies. These technologies of safety into society. Everything changes.
Mm.
And that was it did really change everything as we became more safety conscious in the tools that we brought in. It echoed the parenting and influenced the parenting styles of a generation. And so everything became much more cautious.
Yeah, and I do personally find a lot of value in the work of Haidt and Lukyanov, especially in the coddling of the American mind, where, the basic premise is we overprotect out in the real world and underprotect online. And I think I've seen that in my community play out time and time again, whether there's direct correlation to all the anxiety and all those things. Okay, fine. That might be an open question still, although I think enough evidence is out there to act. And maybe we can come back into this. But before we do that, can you tell me a little bit more about your education? Were your parents educated before you? Kind of tell me what that was like.
No, my mom was quite proud to have a grade 6 status in Greece. My dad had a grade 3. My dad. I have a photograph of him somewhere with standing on a hill with a Tommy gun, during the Greek Civil War, and he's got this full beard, and he's like 17 years old or something, and I'm thinking, like, none of his. I didn't look like that when I was a kid, as sort of that manly military figure. Neither do my children, and it was just very different. So I don't know what it was, if it was the goat's milk or who knows what it was, but it was something very different back then. The olive oil, I don't know.
That's I do understand your AI pictures now a little bit more of
right.
I guess Arnold Alec.
Yeah. No, and he was a huge figure to me, and yeah, in terms of and they didn't have the opportunity for school, so as you might find stereotypically. They were very much like, it's very important that you have an education. We didn't have the chance for an education. So the incredible importance of us being educated and to gain an education and to find new opportunities in this land that they fled Greece. So that immigrant story that I think is common to many that came out of at that time in Mediterranean, but throughout Europe and so on. Those who came, especially in that particular wave of immigration.
And so, was it just essentially established that, like, they wanted you to go to school and you're going to go to high school and go to university? Like, how did they encourage you to be studious and to be a good student?
Well, I don't think there was ever another option. I think it was just like, this is what you're going to do. You're going, and if the importance of educators and teachers was very different there. Like, I would never be believed if I did something wrong at school. I could have the best alibi and story in the world, but my mom was never going to believe me over a teacher. So the authority of the authority of teachers in that sense were really paramount there. And so I still remember coming home and I'd be in trouble with a teacher, and I'd make up something or whatever else, or I'd say why this happened, and very quickly my mother would side with the teacher and say that I have to be better. And yeah, it was really an interesting time. And I think from high school we knew we were going to university. Like, we knew we had to continue. I don't think they ever mentioned like graduate work or a PhD or anything like that. Not because that wasn't important. They just perhaps didn't understand the whole process. Like, they probably didn't understand, terminal degrees and that sort of thing. They just knew that we had to get more and more educated, right? So,
they must have been very proud of you, though, when not only you were educated, but then ended up becoming a professor and doing a PhD in these kind of things.
Yeah, I think so. Like, I didn't go to my convocations because I found them. I didn't go to my undergraduate or graduate or master's convocation because I just found like the whole process boring and so on, and I just didn't want to go. And so they made a big deal that they went to my PhD, that I had to go. I had no choice because there wouldn't be another one, and that was probably one of the proudest moments I've ever had. Like, them feeling proud for me,
Hmm.
That was ever, and I'm sure they felt that same way for my siblings as well. But
Hmm.
overall, they feel that they've accomplished what they weren't ever able to accomplish through their children. So that becomes, of course, something very satisfying and fulfilling for them. So yeah.
Yeah, and my grandmother, I was lucky enough to have her into my late 20s, who also had a grade 6 education, loved school, but just couldn't afford to go to the high school, which was nowhere close to where she lived to in rural Sicily. Told me
Hmm.
many times that the proudest moment of her life was seeing my dad, become a professor and graduate with a PhD.
Yeah.
So I'm certain they were very proud of you. When it comes to your own learning, however, what were the things that you remember just loving to learn?
I mean, my love of learning started. I can tell you the moment I opened my Apple IIc on Christmas when I was in grade seven, and I was probably affected in some way by the plastic or whatever it was, but I smell it. Like I could still smell the packaging, and I opened it up and I felt the surface of this thing and put it together and started to like I didn't have a whole lot of software. I just so I coded a rocket launching in Apple Basic or something like that, and like that became the hobbyist. Like I became the hobbyist, and I had that computer from grade seven all the way. It was interesting all through my high school. Because what else did you really need? I mean,
Hmm.
I did word processing and an image pro two, right, like color printer at some point. And I remember even getting, I still remember opening that box because it was shipped by bus from Saskatchewan to Humboldt, and it was in the winter, and I remember, I remember pulling out of the box, and it was like really, really cold, and putting that together, and the whir of the dot matrix printer and all of that. Yeah, it was interesting.
So when it comes to like what you eventually went on to study, what would you say impacted you the most? Obviously the love of technology from that Apple computer, but in terms of what you studied maybe in undergrad or in high school, what impacted how you think now the most?
So yeah, so the self discovery, as I mentioned, on the computer, being able to think, to use, Papper later on said something like, you can't think about thinking without thinking about something, or how does it go? You can't think about thinking without thinking about something. There's
Mm,
this idea that you need something to think with, and the computer really helped me do that. um, how it basically, like, it wasn't the problems that I was solving, but through thought and through problem solving, it helped me learn how to think. And I think
mm,
sometimes, in school where you have worksheets or fill in the blanks or that sort of thing, you're not really thinking about problem solving in the same way. I mean, obviously there's rote memory tasks and so on. Later on, I think, um, I'm more, recognizing it now, my favorite teachers were much more of the constructivist type, where they didn't have really, the more traditional practice that you saw through most of my elementary, where we just explored. And I remember my grade eight teacher in particular, making learning more fun and non-directed and
mm,
very casual, and you didn't even know you were learning, but you learned a lot of really great things somehow. And it was like magic. And so I think through those constructivist experiences, I really did feel connected to just learning independently and autonomously. And so that was always a big deal. Later on, I was exposed to, people in, through my education, like Alec, Deschooling Society, the idea that, I think you once said, that students are confused, or they're schooled to confuse teaching with learning, great advancement with education, a diploma with competence, fluency with the ability to say something new. Like it was that idea that we're schooled so much that we don't even understand what school is about anymore, right? I think that's similar to his quote. That all of these things that we think are teaching and learning in particular is just schooling, and preparing students for some imaginary workforce, or for being regimented into sort of this new class. So that was that work. If I go back, I think it was also published in 1971 as well. So the year of my Deschooling Society was published in 1971. So although I didn't come to it till much later, I was experiencing it, throughout my entire life, obviously. And then later on, I mentioned McLuhan before, but Postman also talked about how children enter school as question marks and leave as periods, or something like that. Like the idea that often the inquisitiveness and the inquiry is just gutted out of us. And so a lot of that was really important to me. Later on, of course, Seymour Papert, where we talked about the role of the teachers to create conditions for invention rather than providing ready-made knowledge. And so again, it was all the constructivist, inquiry-oriented individuals, the deschooling types, the Alfie Kohn, and the ungrading or anti-grading variety that really helped me learn to focus on learning, and really not abolish assessment, but look at assessment very differently than ever before. So so in terms of, I guess, the way that I look at teaching and learning, I've always been a much more, what feels like it's a radical, but it seems so. To me, it just seems so mainstream and so common sense. But when you're up against, standardized testing regimes and so on, you again feel like a radical, that you can't possibly implement some types of, these types of systems where learning is much more, casual, unstructured. So I guess those are some of my influences, right?
And
the early ones anyway.
Well, okay, there's a lot to unpack there. So maybe let's stay along that train in terms of your work. I think it's safe to say you've worked with thousands upon thousands of teachers and administrators and trustees in K-12 and higher ed over the years. What would you say they are missing in their education on education? Like, for example, you mentioned McLuhan. And there's one example that I think a lot, especially of Canadian teachers, don't know and should know, at least generally, what his work involved and why it's important to teaching and learning. Are there any other areas that you would suggest for teachers to kind of learn about, be aware of? Any folks in particular that would be relevant?
Yeah, I mean, I would still go back to Papert, McLuhan, Postman, Bell Hooks. Those would be individuals that I think are really important. And I think, Bell Hooks, I think, is something that you're seeing more in classrooms. Papert, not as much. I mean, where I think Seymour Papert's work should be paramount. I mean, I still think kids should be playing with Logo just for, things to understand, whether it's algorithmic thinking or just play and discovery. I think those are really important pieces. In some cases, I don't think it's so much who you're exposed to, or I guess who you're not exposed to, but what you're exposed to. And I think that's the learning environments themselves. And we become easily structured by the way curricula, are crafted, and, inflexible in some particular cases. And so I think I think having not only access to individuals who speak about looking at learning radically differently or radically different, but also having those experiences yourself are really important, and valuing those experiences. We often, even the way that maker spaces and some of the more radical learning spaces in high schools are structured, it's like an aside, like a reward, or like it's not built into the essence of what it means to learn. It's sort of like recess. It's sort of, let's take a break from thinking the way that we do in this very structured way, and let's go have some fun with our minds. But this is not really serious. We couldn't do things this way. We have to go back to the other way. So rather than building it from an unstructured process, we see this as, oh, we can also do this, but it's not really serious. So that's been my biggest gripe against my makerspace, is that they're not integrated into the fabric of teaching and learning and schooling, or what we call schooling, I guess.
Yeah. So you sort of earlier pointed to the complexity of changing structures to allow for more of this type of learning to happen. Do you have any insight or even instincts into why it's so difficult? Like, I agree with you in that this vision of learning that you're painting is not radical. Not only is it not radical,
no.
I think everybody, let's take just K-12 education, everybody from the superintendents on down want to do it differently. Why aren't we doing it differently en masse? It is happening in pockets. We know that. We've seen those schools. We've been part of that. We've seen some of these great classrooms. But what's the holdup to doing it much more widely?
Well, it depends. In Canada, it depends which province. Obviously, standardized testing is one of these issues. Like, teachers don't think they can get to what they're expected to get to, unless, of course, they do it in a very straightforward manner. So they're not developing thinkers; they're developing individuals that know particular parcels of knowledge that have been flagged as being important, and the thinking process itself is not as important as what the product is, and so that becomes an issue. So standardized testing and curricular regimes becomes an issue. There are certainly a lot of teachers that they're not trained, through professional development opportunities or through teacher education programs to do things as radically as they can be, or if they are, there's a separation from what you do in teacher ed versus school. And I often see that even if you have a really strong program, say if we have a 4-year undergraduate program in teacher education, and maybe students that 7th of 8th semesters goes out into the field, and it feels like one semester you can unlearn everything that you've done in 7 semesters, and then by the 8th semester you come back thinking that there's nothing else you can learn. Like there's a disconnect between the theoretical and the practical, and it's not that you can't do the theoretical, the more radical in schools, but there's just not. It's much more difficult, obviously. The theoretical is always more difficult to make possible, but there's just such a disconnect in terms of theory and practice from a teacher education perspective to what's happening in the fields, and of course the closer alignment, even with closer alignment, it doesn't make the more radical possible, I guess. It just makes the more radical, it's brought down a few levels. So you still get to do some of that, but you're not necessarily doing it as the way it was intended. And again, it becomes that aside thing that you can also do maker spaces, and and you can do critical thinking and some constructivist tasks, but for the most part we're going to do the real work of teaching and learning, right? There is a disconnect, and those entities, I mean, not being essentially outside of practice, outside of internships and field experiences, between teacher education and the K to 12, there really isn't much alignment or association. Like those you would think that those two institutions would be much more, there would be much more porous together, that there would be many more ways of connecting in ways that would benefit everybody. And I don't think that's happening. So, it very, very quickly, very quickly, the possibility of education becomes this institutionalized vision.
Yeah, and so is the case there, you have one institution of the higher ed, which is cumbersome and slow to change, and then the other institution of K-12, which is maybe even more cumbersome and slow to change, rubbing up against each other.
Yeah. You hear the old joke, it's like, how many professors does it take to change a light bulb? And people are like, change? Right? Like, change? What do you mean change? And I've heard that same joke told by, for teachers as well. And obviously, institutions are tough to change. And again, not to disparage anyone within either of these institutions, there's plenty of really great things coming on, but on the whole, we're not progressing as we should. I don't think many honest people would admit within those institutions that there isn't a lot more that we could do.
Well, okay, so one of the themes of the podcast is, let's look at education really honestly and bluntly, and kind of look at what we can improve. But the other side is, of course, as you just mentioned, there is really great work going on. In those scenarios, when you've been in a classroom and you've been like, wow, this is it. This is the work that we need to happen. What would you suggest are the reasons that it was happening in that school? Is it, for example, the trustees are on board, the community gets on board? Is it the principal that leads that work, or is it a group of teachers? From your experiences, what would you indicate is the specific areas or people that need to force that change?
I think you identified it. Yeah, yes, it's all those things, right? Like having everyone around the shared vision for education. It's hard to identify. Like when I observe teachers who really get it, who really have created and transformed their classrooms, it's like what you don't see. It's not what you see. It's what you don't see. Like I feel like I sit in and there's not teaching going on, like in terms of classroom teaching. Students are all at different levels, doing different things, working on projects. They will routinely come up to the teacher to ask questions, but they're working together for the most part. There's a fair amount of noise happening in those classrooms, but there's also laughing and happiness, and as Dean gets into like that joy in a classroom. But it's not super directed. It feels like it's, like I don't know what they're studying, but they're studying something, and they seem to be, solving problems. And what class is this really? Like those are the classes that make you feel good when you walk out. That you had no idea what actually happened, but that learning, like you could identify that school, it was actually happening. Whereas you can, and I'm still blown away by a good lecture at times, like when there's an engaging lecture or a set of activities that a classroom teacher does, and then those are good too. It's just that doesn't impress me as much as something that is so incredibly chaotic, I guess. And I feel that there's more happening, and the students have gone to a level where they can they can work in that way. And it's not just a couple of students. It's like everyone's moving in a way that they're working collaboratively together for solving big ideas. And I see that once in a while, but I don't see it often enough. And maybe that's better for some classrooms and sub-disciplines, and it's hard to see that, to know for sure how that even happens. But behind it, I know there's, the principal comes in, doesn't see this as unusual, right? Like I've seen the principals that have come in my past, including my own classroom. Like if there's too much noise, is there any learning going on? And if a trustee came into the classroom, it would be the same answer. They'd be okay with that. They know something's happening. They perhaps don't know what's happening, but they've at least been privy to the possibility that this is an unusual classroom, but a lot of really good things are happening. Their children are telling them that they enjoy this class. There are messages and communication from the community. And at the same time, it's one of those, like, I've always disliked, and this is part of my foray into open education. Students will create something amazing, and then they put it on the bulletin board, and it's just, I always used to call it the oppression of the bulletin board. Like, it's there for all the kids to see and for the parent and the TAs and so on, but no one really gets to see this incredible work. And so what is the point of even doing it? Like, you might have learned something, but why not? If it's that good, if you're that proud of it, if it's good work, why not make it available to others? And so I'm a big fan of putting it out there. If we really believe in our students' work, we should be able to publish, make it proud, put it on newsletters, on the website, showcase it in any way possible to make it available to others to see, as at least a glimpse into what's happening, and not just the products, but also the process, that got to that, to these really great artifacts of learning. So, I as a student, I was always disincentivized by, I don't get to read this to the class, like simple things like that. Like, I want to read that poem that I wrote to the class, and I want them to hear it. And then on this huge other digital scale, of course, we didn't have the internet for me to publish it and for me to get praised by others outside of the classroom. That's going to make me do work differently. Now, that's not going to work for every kid in the same way, but for me at least, and for some kids, having it to a larger audience makes, sure, there's more pressure, but at the same time, there's that pressure for some kids at least can shape a reality where you're actually much more motivated. Maybe you don't even like your teacher and you don't want to produce something for them, but you care about a wider audience. That's a different incentive to me, and a different way of motivating students. I think, at least some students. We always have to be careful not to push that particular, for a number of reasons, particular narrative on others. For some, they're okay with it being just seen by themselves, and that's okay.
Excellent. So, Alec, you've always been a strong advocate for open education, network learning. Like, when we're talking now about how education has changed and can change, can you kind of explain what those terms mean in practical terms, and how you think they've shaped kind of them, or will shape, the modern learning environment?
Well, so on openness, I think about, we actually have John Walitsky coming in. He's doing a presentation, I think, next month at we have him as an invited guest, and we just had David Wiley, who coined the term open content. And he had a great presentation on the intersection of AI, artificial intelligence, and open educational resources. And anyway, it was interesting, provocative. Lots of people came out. I think there was 800 people who came out, because these are both interesting topics. But on open education, I think, as a professor, I found that like a real contradiction in what we were expected to do. We're supposed to publish papers, do research on the public dime, right? Because I work in a public institution, then give it away to a paper, to a journal company, which are often, companies of some sort who are making a lot of money on this, who then sell it back to your institutions through library fees or journal fees and so on. So like, who am I working for exactly? Why am I doing this free labor? And so the idea of open access really made a lot of sense to me. Like, why shouldn't I be giving it back to the public? Like, if the public is paying for this research, why shouldn't it go back to the public? And then later on, going back to Walensky, he wrote the access principle, I think back in 2006 or 2007. And that was a commitment to the value of a commitment to the value and quality of research carries with it the responsibility to extend the circulation of such work as far as possible and ideally to all who are interested in it and who might profit from it. And so, like, when we are researchers, we are expected, especially public university researchers, we should be expected to put that back in. Like, we carry that responsibility to put it back out there. And so that was, around, open access journals, which are many out there. And of course, there's lots of FUD out there from, fear, uncertainty, and doubt put out there by the big publishers who want to continue this particular model of publication and to continue their billion-dollar conglomerates. And so they say, they tell you that open access journals they're not peer-reviewed, which, many of them are. They're not well cited, which of course many of them are. They're not credible. Of course, many of them are. There's tons of really bad proprietary predatory journals out there as well. But anyway, there's lots of FUD in the academy, and of course, people who just don't believe it or who are very protective of their IP and so on, but are willing to give it away to publishing companies. So anyway, from the publication aspect, I thought, well, doesn't that make a whole lot of sense in learning? Like, why can't we open up our classrooms? And that's why, 2007, the year before, sort of MOOCs became coined by Dave Cormier. I put out an open web course, and I think I can't remember the numbers anymore. Like, I had a big for that one. Like, there was 20 people in the class, and then 200 people from the outside web showed up, and they were mentors. So I had 10 mentors to every one of my students, roughly, which was a really weird thing. And so lots of voices to look for each student's work. And then after that, I think I did EdMOOC in 2013, and like 12,000 people showed up or something. And so it was really, for me, like those have been some of my greatest experiences. Is just this idea of finding people who want to learn and bringing them together. And there's nothing stopping us from doing that anymore in a network world with all of the tools that we have now. And even back then, we didn't have Zoom and we didn't have all of these other tools. And so I kind of put things together. There was something called Ustream, and then I somehow made that work with Skype, and I put all these tools together to create sort of like some sort of ad hoc Zoom, and we were able to learn together, and yeah, it was neat. And so that's been a big part of how I see learning. I still think it's a valid idea. I think it's problematic in some ways with the rise of trolls and spam and all of the other things that are happening. We just have to have more education around sort of the pitfalls of it too. But ideally, as a way of learning, it's something I continue to believe in.
So when you now look forward to the impact of AI, and I know you've been doing a lot of work with districts and higher ed institutions around AI, how do you view that as different than past technological innovations that have inevitably impacted education? So feel free to take it in a couple different ways. Like, if you want to look at, like, I can think of obviously the internet as being the most quote unquote disruptive to the previous educational model. And then maybe we look at AI and see how it's similar or different.
So I think, the open access movement was one thing where you could look to, I think it was around 99, Charles Vest, who was the president of MIT, decided to create something called open courseware. So he basically said, all MIT coursework is going to be on the web. It's going to be available to anyone. Of course, the courses themselves weren't there, so this wasn't quite the MOOC movement yet. But the materials are all going to be available. And he essentially said that, content has become useless, and that, the real value of universities is the relationship with your instructor, the time that you have, talking about these things. And he really touted the idea of the residential university at the time, but ultimately saying that, Psych 100 or CS 100 is going to be the same or very similar at every university in the world. So content is just, it's out there, right? And so I think that was really an interesting time. And of course, you fast forward ahead to say 2005 and you see YouTube, and all of a sudden you had anyone could upload videos, and soon you had TED Talks and vloggers with some really interesting content, and people could produce and publish content very, very quickly. And people like Michael Wesch, I love his work, talked a lot about that. He did the anthropological look at YouTube, around that time, maybe 2008, 2009. He was one of the people that really influenced the way that I looked at the web and the way that I present. I think he was probably one of my biggest influences. Dr. Michael Wesch, he's from Kansas State University. But really, this idea that you build together and collaboratively, and you build these networks, and you share your content, and you can remix content. And so, the idea of the remix was really big. The mashup was really big in my work and the way that I work with my students in particular. And then of course getting into things like Larry Lessig's work and trying to figure out the copyright of all of this. The Creative Commons was really big because we learned that we had not only the right to give away our rights, so this all rights reserved world where everything was about mine, but you could actually say, I'm going to give you some of these rights. I'm going to relinquish the right to. All you have to do is give me attribution, but you can share alike, you can remix, you can you can do whatever you want with the content as long as you give it back to the community, for instance. So that was a really big thing for me. Now, as all this content worked its way out to the web, obviously as individuals were doing this, and we were developing this shared expertise. At the same time, AI is, peeking its head around a door, and, people started getting into, machine and deep learning, and there was all of this content that could learn from all of this in some other really interesting collective manner and this aggregate manner. And obviously all of the good and all of the bad was collected in this. And for us to see, ChatGPT in 2022 emerge, and of course it was, that was already by version 3, so it had been around for a number of years, but that particular manifestation of this consumer-ready generative AI tool really opened a lot of eyes at that time, because all of a sudden you can write a Hamlet essay with very little effort, and it wasn't exactly like the one, but very similar to everyone that you've ever seen. And the next time you did it, it would be very different again this time. And now, to see the possibilities, of course, in the last couple of weeks, people have been playing with, Google's Notebook LM tool, where you can create podcasts in seconds from content. And it's a really great tool for bringing in resources and asking questions of those resources. You can do that in the classroom. I've already seen professors already bring this into their students and say, this is how you can help, study for my class. Put that into a Notebook LM and ask it questions, and you're connected directly to the knowledge. So how is this different? I mean, it's interesting because it built in all of the sort of the functionality, not necessarily the ethos, but the functionality of what we could do before in an instantaneous manner. I can remix and put things together of course, it doesn't have any of the attribution. Well, not depending on which tool you use, but but it doesn't necessarily have all the attribution. It doesn't have necessarily all of the legalities quite correct, certainly yet. I think there's a lot to be worked out in the courts in terms of intellectual property. But at the same time, I don't know if people were really doing it either. When you developed a New York Times style article, although you weren't doing it with machine learning before, you were doing it in a way that you've read 1,000 New York Times articles before, and you knew what that looked like. And even if you didn't have it directly in front of you when you're copying it, you are copying it. And so, AI is machine learning is a very similar, not equivalent, but similar to how our brains function. In these black boxes and how we put things together. And people argue that AI can never be creative. It's only going to be synthetically creative. And I argue against that. I think that it can be as creative as us, really, because it does the same processes, really. And how, can it extend beyond our creativity? Well, I think in some cases it can. I truly think that, or if it's not right now, it will be able to. And of course, a lot of this comes down to how we classify terms like intelligence or creativity. But that's the only limitation here. In terms of it doing what we did in the past with creating something new, and I think that's people are really hung up on this idea of the newness of what it creates. I don't think we've created anything new for a very long time. Humans in general have created something new. I don't know what novelty means in a creative sense, I guess.
Yeah. I think probably the operative essay there is T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent. And that might give some indication as to what humans are doing when it's actually new, but how much is actually built on tradition. And I mean, I think you can almost have a Turing test for creativity. Like, will an AI write a play, a poem, a movie script that makes a human cry? You know what I mean?
Right.
If it does that and moves us, like art is meant to move us or change our perspective on things, then yeah, you can say it. I think you can say it's creative. How do you think AI in particular changes our views of public education?
Well, it depends, I guess. I think there have been a number of big ideas that have not gone very far, like the one laptop per child from I think it was Nicholas Negroponte, who said if we just give a laptop to every kid out in the world, right, they're going to have much better access to education. So we give every kid a laptop in sub-Saharan Africa, and these are durable. They're plastic. They have long battery time. They're preloaded with some content. They can be networked in these mesh networks, and we're just going to basically save these kids here. And so this really colonial mindset. And you can even see, I think, if you go on the page today, the OLPC site. I'm going to go there now just to take a look at it. There's for sure going to be photographs of kids in these particular environments with a couple of white saviors standing in the midst of these individuals, and that's sort of the model there. And I get I think it's a really cool idea. But did it have any benefit? I think on paper, a lot of these are really great ideas. And the same thing with AI. I'm worried about, I guess, I think there's already people are talking about anyone can have access to a tutor with ultimate knowledge. You can ask it any question that you have. But like which AI do you have access to?
Hmm.
How many, how intelligent is it? Is there, like, what's the difference between a kid to get access today to GPT-3 versus 4 versus 5? And how does that change things, in terms of what you have access to do? And what are the restrictions on each of those? On each of these, what sort of software or hardware do you need to run this technology?
Mm-hmm.
What will it mean when some kids have access to these, this super intelligence versus, kids who do not have access, or to AGI in the next coming few years that will be superior to your intelligence? Then, of course, what does it mean for job markets and all of that beyond education? What jobs will be eradicated? What will be left? Who will be left to work? Will that be a good thing? Will we want to work, or will we not want to work? What will be
Mm-hmm.
left of the jobs out there? Will I be better to be unemployed and to have universal basic income, or not? So I think there's some really big ideas, but when you actually for AI and education as a democratizing force and something that would provide access, just like the One Laptop per Child project had some really good ideas. But when it actually comes out and it's implemented, is this actually going to be, is the playing field going to be less level than it was before? And I kind of worry about that at this point. The other thing too is, who's developing these models? Like, we have the unfettered, the the ones that you have access to. There's a book by, I'm trying to remember now. It's on the Big Nine: How the Tech Titans are and their think machines could warp humanity, by Amy Webb. And she talks about the Big Nine. So it's the Big Nine are Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, IBM, Apple, and then there's 3 Chinese companies, Tencent, Baidu, and Alibaba. So the nine big companies are obviously the big tech giants, right? And the 6, of course, are doing their own thing. The American companies are doing their own thing. Government's not intervening because they just kind of let government do this thing. Of course, the 3 in China are heavily pushed by the government and regulated by the government. But ultimately, the technology that you get is devoid of ethics. It is a reflection of the companies that made it. There's something called Conway's Law, which says that the absence of stated rules and instructions, the choices that teams make tend to reflect the implicit values of their tribe. So the idea that,
in other words, AIs that reflect tech bro thinking, or
exactly, yeah,
or governments that are pseudo fascist.
Absolutely, and that's a perfect way of putting it, right? So you're going to get, the tech bro, ChatGPT type things, or the Meta glasses, right? The other day, I think Zuckerberg, put out these VR glasses, right? And then I think I yesterday posted something around how these things can dock someone. Essentially, the AI and these glasses can look at you. They can use some sort of lens to find out who you are, find out where you live, and so on, very quickly, which is a very tech bro type of attitude when it comes to personal privacy and so on.
Yeah.
And so, what version of AI are you getting ultimately in school or for students? And then how does it make a difference in terms of what that does to society? And the bigger thing, for instance, is, the restriction. I can go into Grok. I'm not an Elon Musk fan by any means, but I can go to Twitter's or X's Grok, and if I want to create an image of Trudeau or Pierre Poilievre or Trump, robbing a bank, I can do that. I don't think that's a good thing for me to do, but none of the other things do that either. Like ChatGPT will not let you. So there's a dilemma. Is it okay that we restrict those things? And what other things can we restrict? Or should we have this anything goes mentality. I think those things should be blocked, but are they blocked for everyone? So obviously to be blocked, someone has access to these things somewhere. So if a certain group of people have access to that, and right now, the people that have access to that are anyone who has access to an open source version of these tools has access to those unrestricted, unfettered versions of this. So in the future, we might see control, whereas the big six or the big nine say, you don't get access to open access tools. We're going to kill these one way or the other, and you will only have access to a corporatized version. But the people in the back rooms who need this, the journalists that are out of the state, for instance, if we think those who want to manipulate minds and so on, will have access to that, but the rest of you can't have access to those tools. So that type of thing worries me in terms of who has control to the keys of this AI coming out. Open source could be a really great thing that will give everyone ultimate access to all tools, but at the same time, it can be a terrible thing. And I think the big six are going to make the case that we can't have these open source tools anymore because they are a security risk. Therefore, let's make sure that we make these other six players the dominant ones and make sure that you don't provide any regulation on us.
Yeah, and they don't even have to give justification. They're private companies. They can do whatever they want with their tools however they want.
Right.
So in light of Sam Altman's, what I find quite horrifying letter about superintelligence and the time frame there, what do your intuitions tell you? Yeah, what did he say? 4,000 days or something like that?
Or I think it was a few thousand days. I believe it was. Yeah,
a few thousand days.
Yeah.
What are your intuitions telling you about rushing towards superintelligence?
Well, this is where I would bring in the book to read. Here we go. Is Human Compatible by Stuart Russell.
I've got it somewhere here. I thought I had it right next to me. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. This idea of the and this was subtitled "The Artificial Intelligence and the Problem of Control," and I do think that's the issue. And there's been plenty of really great thinkers on this on these ideas that if we do hit super intelligence, what does that mean for us? Especially if it's not just super intelligence, but it's the agent aspect of this. If this superintendent intelligence can be put into an autonomous agent, what does that mean to our power grids and to our financial systems and to everything else that's smarter than us that can control our highly networked world of apparatus that keep us alive? And the fair, the various theories around the idea of AI. At that point, when it becomes super intelligent, we won't be seen as anything else but ants. Like, we're sort of irrelevant to them. Or the other aspect could be like, we actually have to keep these things, alive because they need to be powered on these grids and they need power to function and so on. Just the kind of sci-fi, at this point they seem very fictional possibilities or futures that we have with these particular tools. I do think we're going to get to the point where AGI, at the very least, if not superintelligence, will be reached in a reasonable time. And I think maybe a 10-year span of time is reasonable from everything we know. We can't possibly know. We don't have what's the inside knowledge of these things, and of course you have to take Sam Altman's announcement as a grain of salt. He just got a bunch of new funding and so on, and of course if the company doesn't look like it's progressing into this new territory, and Zuckerman's made similar announcements lately as well. that they're moving towards this, image of VR and so on. So I think that, that's part of that culture of finance, that they have to continue to make sure that they're seeing new things. And I think one of the things actually made it in the book that I mentioned before around the 9 companies, the Amy Webb book, is, if you think about, like, Apple has to every single year on target, like all these companies have to make big tech announcements. Like they have to come up with something. If nothing is there to announce, then like they feel like a failing company. So if they don't continue to announce amazing new things on schedule every fall, then what's going on? But innovation is necessarily like that. Like you may not hit something as significant to tell or to explain. So either you stifle or schedule your innovations, or you just make up things. I don't know where I was going with that question, but I do think that it is, and there are amazing possibilities of what's possible out there in terms of, I think, medicine in particular. I think there are amazing things that I look forward to seeing in terms of where this goes. But I don't think superintelligence is the problem. I think the people behind superintelligence are the problem. Like the human actors behind all of this is the biggest threat to humanity, not superintelligence by itself.
Yeah, and I would agree. And I mean, it's just kind of easy to see why, because they're going around our institutions, right? The institutions, right. The one we've been spending the most of the conversation today talking about, education, they've been trying to do an end around for years to find better programmers that they can get more effectively into their worker pipeline and things like that, let alone the institutions of government, of checks and balances. So I couldn't agree more there. But let's assume that we stave off the co-opting of society by the tech bros and the superintelligence. As someone who's seen like education technology in particular evolve firsthand and be right on that frontier, what do you see the next frontier of EdTech looking like in the years to come?
Not exactly how, people like Salman Khan look like, where everyone has this intelligent tutor, thing. And there's been lots of discussion on that. Because Dan Meyer, who's a mathematician, talks about this, and he's one of the biggest critics of Salman Khan and that particular model. That that's going to help a few kids in your class, but for the most part, they need motivation from somewhere else. There's lots of great tools that fit the classroom that you think are cool as an educator and useful. But in terms of engaging students and prior assessment and, really helping a student as to where they are and not just their working on their developing their competencies in certain areas, whether it's numeracy or literacy, but also, connecting with that kid in a social and emotional way, that's not going to happen. And so I think, obviously that's an issue. That's an issue. But I do think, I do think tools like Notebook LM, where you can query articles, query podcasts, videos, and that sort of thing, like a collection of resources in a way to work with it in an intelligent way as an intelligent assistant is a way that we're probably moving. I think AI, I think OpenAI even opened up some sort of Canvas or notebook or whatever it was the other day. I know Claude's got something like that as well, where you can sort of see the result at the same time as your prompts. I do like that sort of working in unison, where you can see your work and the results of your work at the same time. Uploading resources, having direct access to source files and pointing it to sources versus just having, intuition from all of the training data. I think that's going to certainly help. Every single time I jump in an Uber, we usually have the driver and I myself have a conversation. Today it was, I spoke to him via my phone. He was speaking Hindi, I was speaking English, and
Mm,
we went back and forth, and we just had a conversation about that. And it was a very human thing that, we started talking about things I wouldn't normally talk to about to my Uber driver, because just met the guy, and you probably never meet him again, but we're talking through a phone. And I just think there are some very rich possibilities for communication and bridging cultural divides and so on. At the same time, it horrifies me in terms of, say, indigenous languages and what that might actually do if it de-incentivizes the the need to speak Cree or Ojibwe or whatever else, and or if it actually further endangers those languages from developing speakers, because there's no
mm.
need to do it if you can connect in those particular ways. So I think for the endangered languages, they may become more endangered in some ways. And then there's a whole debates around, like, what knowledge should be digitized anyway, and how can you remove language from culture, and all of that as well. And so there's some deep, significant questions around all of that as well.
So
But yeah, I think, I do think that personalized learning in some ways is going to happen, but perhaps not in the ways that are certainly expressed right now as these easy tutorial type things.
yeah, and my instincts tell me that I think there's a frontier that'll open up for teacher support, where I think everyone's looking and rushing to like this personal tutor. And I think you shared with me this really creepy, emotionally intelligent, quote unquote, robot that you can buy to raise your child. And that
Yeah.
just seems absolutely horrifying to me. Um, but I do think there will be some really great supports built for teachers to be more effective. We talked about assessment and the kind of grip standardized tests have, but I think there's the opportunity for more innovative tests where, say, you and I can do a presentation to an AI that captures, helps a teacher understand, and helps school districts and universities, assess these giant portfolios of really rich and meaningful student work. So that's where I kind of see
Yeah.
the possibilities. But I also I've realized here, Alec, that I need to have you on for another podcast, because I think you and I can go on for hours and hours, and I feel like we've just started hitting some of the things that really interest me, and I know are really part of your focus right now. But given the time and where
Sure.
we are, I want to move on to always my penultimate question, which is, if you had a magic wand and you can do anything to the education system, and for your perspective, let's say from K to 20, what would you do?
Oh man. Did I miss that question in the prepping? I don't know. It's a tough question. Is this something that you just omit just to make you put someone on the spot?
It's
What would I
actually there,
do?
but I buried it under 75 other
You
questions for
must
you.
have. Yeah, that's a tough question. I might even leave the answer for another response, or I'll try my best to respond. Um, you know, I would like to see. I mean, education in this country actually, and I'll talk about Canada in particular,
Hmm.
I'll talk about my province. I mean, uh, the the ratio of student to teacher ratio is really low. Teacher morale is incredibly low, as it has been, and it's not pay issues. Like, classroom complexity is so incredibly difficult these days. The composition and complexity. So too many students to really handle, and no AI is going to fix that problem. We have all sorts of kids coming in from different backgrounds with you know with all sorts of different baggage, issues with mental health. Kids that who are struggling in so many different ways, and we don't have the supports for them. So bringing in more teachers, more trained adults in various areas, whether that's from mental health services, whether it's from child care backgrounds, to make school a place that is not that you just you do your time. So a place where everyone enjoys, just like they want to go to the swimming pool or to an amusement park or something else, where everyone feels cared for and supported. I mean, there's nothing about technology in there. And I think we do. I don't think enough people. I don't think enough people know how bad it is in some schools these days, and we can compare ourselves to like what we have, and I think many parents think it's kind of the same, but it's not anywhere near to what I had growing up in small rural town Saskatchewan. But 20 years ago, even if this is a city, things were a lot better, and kids were like it's not that teachers are not doing their job; they just can't do their job. It's too difficult. It's beyond their training. It's beyond their limits in terms of their time. I don't know if you've seen that YouTube channel, that YouTube clip. It's from the Newsroom first season with Jeff Daniels, and this freshman says, can you say why America is the greatest country in the world? And the first person says diversity and opportunity. The next someone says freedom and freedom. And Jeff Daniels says the New York Jets, and in a sort of flippant way. And the interviewer said, no, you tell us why America is the best country in the world. And he said, no, that's my answer. And then he pushes them, and then he gets into this really incredible speech around how it's not the greatest country in the world, and how he kind of speaks about how all of these other countries are doing this. Finland does this, and we're number one in males incarcerated per population and all of this other thing. I want to do something like that for Canadian education, because we often think we're in a better shape than we are. And so if someone asking the same question, if you ever watch that, if we could come up with the same dialogue, I think that would be useful, because I think I often hear that you do pretty well there. And we have some unique characteristics of our schools, but ultimately, and I don't think there's a province that doesn't suffer this in some way. We don't have enough teachers. We don't have enough teachers in areas that are less, northern and rural and indigenous areas have. It's very tough to get teachers in many of these places. We're not training teachers in those communities, and often that's what you have to do to have better retention. We're not creating places where kids feel cared for all the time. We're not creating places where it's conducive, and they're not conducive to learning. Kids don't necessarily feel safe in many spaces. And although in some cases, there's plenty of classrooms and plenty of schools that are doing this as well as they can be, but I know we could all be doing better. And I think there's a crisis happening, and it's just getting worse. So that would be my answer, I guess, to a magic wand. I got more serious than perhaps you thought for the end, but
I love it.
I just think that we have lots to build that have nothing to do with technology or anything that we talked about today. It's just around capacity, training, and making sure that schools are what they could be.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that response, and it might be a good place to start our next conversation next time. And I interpreted that as a kind of Roosevelt-style New Deal for education. Is that a good way of understanding what's needed?
Something like that.
Yeah, excellent. We can think about that in the meantime. So, always the last question: a book, podcast, movie, album that you'd recommend to the listeners. I know you've already done one recommendation, but I know you're always into really good stuff.
Yeah, so Human Compatible was one. I would also mention that the book I mentioned earlier as well. That's the one, that the Big Nine: How the Tech Titans and Their Thinking Machines Could Warp Humanity, by Emmy Webb. The Human Compatible was Stuart Russell. Where are you coming from today, Jason?
Kleinburg, Ontario, my friend, just outside
Where's
of Toronto.
Kleinburg?
Just
So
north
outside
of
Toronto. So Toronto,
straight north of Pearson Airport.
One of my favorite artists from the Toronto area is actually Hayden. I think his dad was a U of R prof, but check him out. I don't know if he's done anything recently in the last little while, but he's one of my favorite musical artists, and I have a number of his albums, and I've listened to him since my undergraduate. Well, I don't know, my undergraduate days. He has a bit of a sort of a Neil Young thing to him, a little bit. But
right
one of my favorite
alley.
artists. If you ever get a chance to see him, yeah. But if you ever get a chance to see him, it's great. Check him out.
I love that, and not enough people give me a musical recommendation. So, with that, Alec, thank you very much. Until next time. This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Until next time.